Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. We're going to be talking about second speeches, trying to encompass both whips and deputies within it. So how's this going to work? Somewhat counterintuitively, we're going to start with all of the things that are not in the workshop. So judging, then we'll talk about PMs and extensions, then deputies, then whips. Then when I say advance, I mean questions that were submitted in advance rather than of particularly high quality, as you'll see later. And then audience questions, anything from people. Feel free at any point to ask questions in the Zoom chat. I've got it open so I can see it if you're curious about anything. In terms of the general approach of this workshop, there are a great many workshops about how to give whip speeches or how to give deputy speeches that exist accessibly on YouTube. And so I don't really want to repeat all of them. So if you are not, if you don't have any clue of what you're supposed to be doing in these speeches, this is not plausibly not the best workshop for you. Equally, this is not like super advanced, hyper complicated stuff. These are just my various thoughts on how you can improve and on things that people sometimes forget when they are trying to do sort of take debating at its most intellectual. There are actually a lot of other better things you should be thinking about in order to maximize your chances of winning from these positions. So let's first, and you'll see the slideshow is incredibly low effort, but here we go. Let's start with judges. So judges are varied, shall we say, in BP debating. Judges come in all shapes and sizes with all different kinds of attention spans, with all different kinds of intellectual bandwidth to listen to and process the information that you are saying. Judges might have biases that are going to predispose them to agree or disagree with what you are saying. Some judges are just frankly not particularly intelligent or are not paying attention or are distracted. And that's often the case in particular with online debating at the moment. I think it's so easy for judges to just, zone out, check their phone, whatever, in a way that they probably never would do were they in the room. Judges have time constraints. A judge has got to think about the entirety of 1 hour of sometimes quite dense argumentation and process that into a call, often only within a couple of minutes before the chair starts saying, all right, give me your initial rankings. And if you are the chair, you might have to spend most of your discussion dealing with irritating wings who are very wrong about things rather than clarifying your own understanding of the debate. The sum total of this entire thing is essentially to say that what you are trying to do is not give the best deputy speech in the world or the best whip speech in the world. You are trying to give the speech that the judges, given all of the constraints that I've just listed, are going to find the most persuasive. What that means is that you want to be doing things in your deputy speeches that make judges' lives easier and are done bearing in mind all of the constraints that I've said. This is why some very successful teams, as Lucia was talking about earlier, will say things that just like seem really obvious by the end of the debate. You want to come out of the debate thinking, wow, that debate was so, prop weighted or op weighted to whichever side you think smashed it. Not because the motion necessarily is proper op weighted, but just because they've been able to present the material in such a sort of simple matter of fact way that within only a couple of lines of understanding what their case is about, you buy into it and therefore are willing to say, yeah, I think this team probably won. As a judge, what you're trying to do to rank 4 teams is tell yourself essentially a little story. Why did OG beat OO? And realistically, in your mind, that's probably only going to be for a couple of reasons. Well, I think OG proved this point, and OO's argument about this thing was like largely mitigated or largely irrelevant. Almost all judging decisions, apart from very good judges in very, very good rooms, can usually be summarized in like a couple of sentences as to why one team beat the other team. Oh, they didn't have a meaningful extension, therefore they came behind opening government. Now, that is 14 minutes of material that has been reduced to a single relatively lazy sentence. But that is essentially what you have to deal with when you are debating in the BP format. And hence, your job as a deputy or a whip speaker is to convince the judges not of everything, but of those singular sentences that opening opposition was irrelevant for some relatively easy to understand reason that every single judge on that panel is going to believe. Okay, you've got to tell them a story. Well, this house will ban zoos. We should ban zoos because they're cruel to animals. That's a sentence. And that's something we care about. Sentence number 2. And this is more important than any of the other irrelevant claims of opening opposition. 3 sentences. If you can convince a judge that all of those sentences are true, you will almost certainly win the debate. And so the first and most important thing that you've got to do as a deputy or a whip speaker is flag extremely clearly what those simple sentences are going to be, what that sort of simple 3-sentence story as to why you beat all the other teams in the debate is going to be. And then you've just got to sell it. And the way you sell it, will vary from debate to debate. And I think there are lots of really instructive videos on this and lots of really instructive speakers to look at. So a hilarious example of this from the other day, I'm sure many of you have seen, there's an excellent shitpost, which is a compilation of Hamza basically just mocking people in debates. And it's funny, but it's also incredibly effective. Because if you are able to employ that sort of, and there are lots of speakers, lots of very good speakers who do this, the kind of style of effectively rebutting whilst mocking the other team, you're able to convince a judge that not only is the argument you're rebutting silly, but by them awarding you the first, they're kind of in on the joke, as it were. So all of these sort of dark arts of trying to convince lazy judges who aren't paying attention do matter and are worthwhile considering in debating, as long as you've got your single couple of sentences that tell the story of why you win. Everything else is just building up to that point. You can have the most beautiful structure in the world, but if at face value the judge just says, I just don't think they proved that we care about animals, then all of your hard work goes out of the window. So the first thing you've got to identify, and this is in opening half something you might identify in prep time, in closing half something you'll probably identify as the debate goes on, what is the simplest, most logical single sentence reason that your team wins the debate, and then you sell the hell out of that by rebutting and mocking everyone else, and then explaining why whatever it is your partner said was excellent. So let's then talk about your partner, because if you are the if you are the deputy speaker or the whip speaker, it is always worth thinking quite a lot about the PM or the extension speech. And that's for the reason that really in BP debating, most people don't have that much to say. There are a finite set of arguments that are relevant, persuasive, and can be analyzed to a reasonable extent in 7 minutes without some huge amount of factual knowledge, or without becoming swiftly irrelevant, or are just so complicated that you'll never be able to make them stick in the debate. It means that honestly, most debates only really have about 3 or 4 relevant arguments that it is worth making. What that means is that really, as a deputy speaker, you want to be ensuring that your partner has all of the relevant material that will enable you to tell your story later. So in prep time, if you're, say, a deputy prime minister, you should not be trying to siphon off material from your prime minister. Oh, but what am I going to say in my speech? None of that is very helpful. Instead, what you want to be doing is sort of beefing up and putting every single relevant piece of analysis into that prime minister or that leader of op speech. And in an ideal world, were it not responded to particularly well, that should be enough to win the debate. All of the building blocks of your storytelling must be present in that speech. The same logic applies if you are a whip speaker. If you're a whip speaker, you can't add anything new substantively. Obviously, you can rebut and frame and all of that jazz, but you can't add new claims substantively unless you try and weasel them in and pretend that they're rebuttal when they're not really. But we can maybe talk about that later. What you then have got to be doing throughout the debate is communicating really, really clearly with your prime minister or extension speaking partner. You've got to make sure that if you identify, look, based on what opening gov and opening off have said, the way we can spin this to make our extension be the debate's winning one is by framing it such that, I don't know, something that they've both talked about, oh, you know, are animals indeed harmed by zoos, is entirely irrelevant because the suffering of, we're closing up now, the suffering of animals is like a sort of secondary factor to the betterment of humankind. And here are 20 reasons that I've given in extension as to why the existence of zoos betters humanity. Now, it's kind of a claim in two parts, right? The first claim is that we don't really care about animals. And that's a strategic decision you've got to work out in whip. And you say to your partner, look, almost all of opening gov and opening op is like, oh, are zoos good or bad for animals, whatever it might be. We've identified that a way to sort of neutralize both these two things is to have this set of arguments. Now, you don't need to do very much on that, extension speaker. You just need to flag that that's the case, give a little bit of rebuttal, and then I will do the rest. And then what you've got to do is stick what clearly is the big analytic chunk, right? Of here are all the ways in which zoos are important for humanity's development. Because that, for the most part, is likely to just be a lot of very new, relatively tedious mechanistic analysis. And the tolerance that judges have for new mechanistic analysis in whip is substantially lower than their tolerance for new framing. I could very easily do opening government and opening opposition have like completely failed to understand that all of their argument is contingent on whether we actually care about the rights of animals in whip. And I can frame that very easily as response by saying it's a thing that they did not prove. They never went out and proved to me that we should care about the rights of animals. Here's like a tiny bit of rebuttal that I'll pretend is mostly directed at opening gov, but is clearly also directed at opening op, to say that actually there's no particular reason we should care about animals. We think we should care about humans more. And helpfully then, my extension speaker gave you like 20 different reasons why zoos are really good for humans. So it's also about identifying what you can and cannot get away with in your deputy speech. You're not going to be able to radically change the scope of your case without, you know, probably copying a fourth or something similarly deleterious. What you are going to be able to do is be like, aha, that was our plan all along. All of the stuff we said is really, really relevant and really, really good. And it wins because of this extra layer of framing that I'm now adding in whip. My advice is to always make sure the frame is present in the Prime Minister extension speech. Even if it's not well enunciated or well explained, as long as your extension speaker says, they never proved this, we're going to claim that actually that's irrelevant, and gives like 10 seconds of rebuttal as to what that's about, then you can do all the rest in whip, and it's not new because it's framing, and they already said it in the extension speech. Indeed, it's actively better to do it in the whip for the other simple rules of BP debating. You can, in your whip speech, do a huge amount of rebuttal to your heart's content. What you can't do is add in new material. So if your extension speaker really loves rebuttal and spends half their speech doing rebuttal that you could have done anyway in whip, that was a waste of everyone's time, because now you will be repeating them, and you won't be able to, by not repeating them, save any time that is meaningful, because you can't fill that time with new analysis. So your job then, when the Prime Minister extension speaker is prepping, is to give them the framing, help them with the arguments, not to try and steal arguments away from them, and to ensure that you're communicating with them during the debate. Maybe, I personally find that there is a clear sort of, like, you can't say too much to your partner during the debate, because they're trying to listen, right? And if you're whispering to them or messaging them and being like, oh, we need to say this, they're never going to get it all, right? So you've got to make sure that you just give them really clear, simple instructions. I've worked out that we can win this debate by framing in this way. That's what you've thought in your head. Therefore, they need to say this one thing. And so you're presenting to your partner during the debate, look, it's really important that you say this thing. Start your speech by saying this. And they'll be like, oh, I'm not sure. And just do it. It'll be fine. I will clear it up later. And just making sure that you've got just enough in the Prime Minister and the extension speech that you're not going to be accused of whip standing or of backloading in opening half, you'll be fine. As long as the building blocks are there, you can spin out whatever framing you like and it's still legit. So that's our Prime Minister and our extension speeches, what we should be doing. Deputy speeches then. The first of our second speeches. So what is actually your job here? Now, I think that people, when they start out, get very hung up on the whole not knowing what to say thing. And as we've talked about previously, try and do silly things like not let the PN make one of the 3 best arguments in the round because they want to have something good in their speech. None of that is relevant. We'll talk about what new material you should be bringing in a second. But the first set of things you very obviously have to do as a deputy is win on all of the grounds that you've previously established as being important. So your Prime Minister has made 2-3 arguments, right? They've probably made a model as well. Opening opposition is going to do a whole bunch of things. They're probably going to be like, oh, your model is trash for some reason. You might need to do a bit of clearing up, a bit of clarifying there. Make sure that everyone in the debate is crystal clear about what your model is and there's no room for ambiguity. Don't try and change the model, because that'll just make things more confusing and judges will be more punitive towards you for that. It's not necessarily true that they should, in the rules of BP, say, well, your model was bad, so you take a 4th. But these are the kind of things that judges just have in the back of their minds. My incidental personal belief about how most BP judging works is that most BP judges sort of vibe what they think the call probably should be, and then retrospectively find reasons in their notes to justify their intuitions, which is also why things like rep calls happen all the time, right? Because someone's like, oh, well, I think probably, Oxford A won. Let's look at my notes. Aha, I've convinced myself now that Oxford A did indeed win. Good for, well, not Oxford A at the moment anyway, rip Oxford debating. But you know what I mean. So trying then to make sure all of these arguments are strictly relevant to the material that you've brought in Prime Minister. So we've established our model makes sense. Then we need to make sure that all of our arguments stick. So what are the key attacks that were given by opening opposition? We also want to be thinking about what engagement was given by the closing half teams. Always, always, always make sure that the Prime Minister or the leader of op takes a POI from closing. Never take a POI from your other opening. It's just a waste of time. You're going to hear whatever it is they have to say shortly. Insist that you take a POI from closing. It might even be worth saying very early on, like, I want to take a POI from closing. Ensure that you do. Equally, you should be listening incredibly carefully to any POIs your closing gives to the team opposite you in opening half. So we now know what opening opposition has said in response to our partner's material. We are going to rebut and rebuild. We might want to add in a few bits and pieces there. In effect, you're giving a sort of mini whip speech to what has already been said by your Prime Minister, ensuring that after this section of your speech, there is no doubt in the judge's mind that your Prime Minister's case was relevant, is winning the debate, and is impactful and is going to last until the end of the debate. Once you've done that, you should probably deal with whatever their case is. Now, it might be the case that lots of the things they say match up quite nicely to yours and you've already talked about them. But it's also very possible that there will be lots of things being said. What? Oh, yes. Yes, I can. Oxford are trash these days. Anyway, well, some of them are good. Sorry, I'm being privately messaged by someone. All right, so yes, once you have whipped the relevant parts of your partner and ensured that they stick, then we're going to rebut whatever it is they say. And it's worth doing a really thorough job here. Go after the things that stick at the top. Go after the main things that have been said. If a POI from closing op has come in, let's say you're opening up, closing op has come into your partner, spend extra time on that. You should also, this is kind of hard to do in online debating, but in-person debating, you know what these people are like. The very classic closing op thinks they've got some extremely clever frame. They will do things that are highly suspicious, like when you are making an argument, bang the table and say, here, here, if they're Australian, or just nod their heads vigorously and get very excited when opening government is saying gov material. Suddenly closing op seems very, very excited. Probably they've got some argument or frame that's sort of like a, aha, but because of this, actually this opposite thing or whatever happens. So take all those visual clues and have at least an inkling of what you expect closing opposition to say. But even if you don't, it's worth just shielding yourself against any of the very obvious attacks. If you think that your case has a set of responses, and probably in prep time, you've kind of thought at least a little bit about what the other bench could say in response to your case, it may well be worth thinking about what was not said. If opening opposition did not make these sort of sensible responses to your case, then it is very likely that closing opposition will, so it might be worth buffering against those. So we spent a bunch of time rebutting, we spent a bunch of time rebuilding. Once we've got through all of that, it is probably the case that the next thing it is worth doing is doing some new arguments. Now, there are different ways to do new argumentation in deputy. Indeed, some people don't even bother at all. There are lots of very good teams. So, for example, I'm thinking of people like the old Yale A, Evan and Henry, would almost never have new material in deputy. It would almost exclusively just be a whip of the prime minister. But if your prime minister is sufficiently efficient and matter dense, then that's all you need to do. But if you are adding new material, and it usually is a good idea to add some new material, there are a couple of things that are worth doing. The first thing is to sort of minimize the amount of time realistically you're spending on this. You're probably spending a couple of minutes at the end of your speech, right? Maybe 2-3 minutes. It's also worth bearing in mind what the purpose of your argument is going to be. If this argument is actually a crucial part of your case so far, the missing mechanism that you sort of in prep time were like, oh, we'll explain why it's bad, and we'll explain why this thing happens and why it's bad, but we won't bother with any comparatives until deputy, you've probably made a bit of a strategic mistake. But if it is the case that it's an integral part of what you're saying, you might need to allocate a bit more time. But hopefully the kind of broad thrust of the opening gov case or the opening op case, what you're going to be credited with winning or losing the debate on, has already been said by the combination of the prime minister and your rebuttal and rebuilding in the first like 4 or 5 minutes of your deputy speech. What then should you do with the last bit? And it is worth remembering what you're not trying to do here. You're not trying to radically shift your case. You are very unlikely to win the debate with this 3 minutes, 2-3 minutes of random stuff at the end of your deputy speech. What you are trying to do is cover your bases. And so what that means is you might want to, on the basis of something you suspect the closing team on the other bench is going to say, introduce an extra layer of argumentation, framing, justification, whatever it might be, to head off if there are any hanging premises. So for example, the thing we talked about earlier is if no one has really explained why we ought to care about the rights of animals either above or equivalently to the rights of humans, it might be worth just throwing some material in there. Even if this material isn't perfect, you've at least done it, and judges can't say, oh, you never justified this thing. It's about thinking about sort of what do you need to do in order to not let judges have easy reasons to give you false. That's the first thing you could be thinking of. The second thing you could be thinking of is maybe there's some particular impacts that are a bit more out there, shall we say, that are maybe not the main case, but you think are worth throwing in to sort of confuse everyone so you've got at least one big scary sounding impact towards the end. Bring in a different actor, perhaps, to the debate. Incidentally, banning zoos will actually be really terrible for the environmentalist movement for 2 minutes of various things, and that's, here are some simple impacts and we should care about that. And you're just giving another big chunk of things for the other side to deal with. In particular, what's very common is that you might see people then spending a good chunk of time on this, or the opposite, completely ignoring it altogether. You make an argument at sort of 5 minutes in deputy, and the deputy leader of op is still sort of scrambling to get all their notes together for their speech. Probably their responses to this last bit are going to be sort of a bit unstructured, a bit shoddy. They might miss things. They also might just spend loads of time dealing with it because they're sort of making it up on the spot and haven't had time to write stuff down yet. But you're trying to create obstacles. The last thing, obviously, you're trying to do is turf burn. To say arguments such that your closing can't really say them and claim them as their own. Are there any obvious big arguments that have not been made that have not been said? Are there anything that you sort of picked up on from interactions? For example, if you are Deputy Prime Minister, did closing government POI things to opening opposition that weren't necessarily directly about opening opposition's case, or were challenging a core premise of their case that you expect to be brought up later? Here, again, bear in mind, you're not trying to win based on these couple of minutes. All you're really doing in this is you're trying to make it harder for the other teams to win on whatever grounds they want to win on. If the rest of your case is not very good, then this probably isn't going to help very much. But what it can do is buffer you quite substantially against what the other teams could go on to say later on in the debate. So you've got your nicely structured case that has now been rebuilt. You've rebutted everyone. You've chucked in a bit of turf burning for good measure. You have dealt with any POIs. Take another POI, I would say. I just honestly, at some points, I just don't even bother taking POIs from the other opening team. Take both of them from the closing team so you get more chance to engage with them. It's always good to demonstrate engagement on diagonals, particularly if you're worried about the closing half team in debates. So that is broadly deputies. I noticed thus far that we have no questions at all. So I will assume that this is all either like trivially excellent or no one is listening. So next, a question. Yes, go.
May I do it by voice?
Sure.
So what do you think it's more effective? Is it doing turf burning, or is it doing a bit of meta and explaining like, hey, the main clash of the debate is this, and we've already discussed it. No matter what opposing opposition or opposing government brings, it's going to be dependent or it's going to be less important. So which one of the strategies do you think is more efficient?
Okay, yeah, fair question. I think if you can prove that what you have already said is debate winning in of itself, so it doesn't matter what other teams have said, you've addressed like whatever the major issue of the debate is, and you've explained why it matters and blah, 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 then yeah, that is going to be more important. I guess what I sort of generally getting at here is that in an ideal world, you should have already done that. That should have been very clear from your prime minister's frame. That should have been very clear from your prime minister's frame that you are debate winning based on this anyway. By the time you get to the now it's time for my new material section of your speech, you should hopefully have got to the stage where you don't need to do that anymore. If you feel like you haven't done enough of it, then yes, I would just cut it down. Again, like you can turf burn quite easily in like a minute and a half. And then the closing team will be like, oh, they only mentioned this in the last minute, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, yeah, sure we did. But again, most debating arguments are relatively straightforward. And so as long as you hit all of the key parts of the argument with at least a little bit of information, you're trying to do it. Also, it's just really easy to like scare teams in a way. Like if you say like a minute and a half of arguments about something, there are a lot of people who will freak out and be like, oh no, I definitely can't say this anymore because they said some of it, even if like in reality, if they did say it, it would probably be fine because they have enough new material. So again, it's about thinking, how can I like inconvenience or make the lives of the other three teams harder? Because probably by that point in your deputy speech, you've kind of said all of the relevant, important stuff for your set of clashes. If there is an extra argument that you think like really neatly ties to get your case together, I would preference that. But it is still worth doing a little bit of turf burning. Certainly if you've got any information to go on. If closing gov, if you're OG, if closing gov has made a POI that sounds highly suspicious, like it's probably going to be part of their case, or you have an inkling of the kind of things they're going to run, it's always a good idea to at least do a little bit of that. Another question. DLO backloading, dick move, or easy third? I mean, it's part of the game, right? I think where backloading becomes a problem is if it sort of radically changes what the leader of ops speech is. I'm not really bothered about it from a fairness perspective, because like by the same logic, closing op is just like eternally backloading over opening gov in all circumstances. It's more just that if your case only becomes like relevant in the second speech, probably it stands up to less scrutiny. The material in the leader speech is less relevant, etc. But it's part of the game, and I think backloading is often just people being like, oh no, my arguments from Deputy Prime Minister have been rebutted and now I am sad. So no, it's fine to do it. There are another two speakers in the debate to rebut you. The only team that you could conceivably say that's unfair to compare you against is opening government anyway. But as long as it's not like a radically different shift that invalidates the vast majority of what opening gov says, I think it's just like a pretty common part of the game that, you know, judges just deal with. It's the same with the sort of distinction between what is legitimate new rebuttal and what is illegitimate new substantive material. If you know what CO is saying but can't offer substantive on it, only rebuttal, then how should you headline your response? Is this in the case where I'm OG or the case where I am OO? So is this a team on my bench or a team that I'm against? Okay, if I'm OG, I know what they're saying. I can't offer any meaningful substantive only rebuttal. How should you headline your response? I mean, honestly, rebuttal and substantive are just the same thing. If you think about them, really, they are. So any piece of rebuttal you can turn into a substantive argument. But they said like their argument was X, X is not true. You're going to be like, we're going to make the argument that X is not true. Hooray, you have achieved debating. So I would say just spend enough time on it that whatever it is they're saying, you've undermined to an extent. Like pre-rebuttal is fine. Some people are lazily explicit about this and will just say, it seems from CO's POI that they're going to make a case about thing X. Here are 4 reasons why thing X is irrelevant. The downside of that is that they could then radically shift their case, or indeed it might not be what they're actually going to say, but it's probably better than having nothing if you have nothing else to say. Hopefully, if you're a deputy speaker, you've got quite a lot of things you can say, and so it's really a question of prioritization, but it is worth addressing what you think is likely to come out of a closing team. What exactly does framing your case in second mean? Assuming your prime minister has already done the weighing and provided the frame, won't you just sound repetitive? So hopefully your PM has set up why this material matters. A lot of the framing in deputy is going to be framing in response to whatever it is the opposition says. So I don't know, let's say you get a motion like we should pay more welfare to families whose children do well in school, and you make a case about like, oh, this is like really good and they will like learn better and gives them incentives to do good in school, blah, 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 blah. Probably in any kind of policy motion, you're certainly in a policy motion like that, you are very much expecting there to be some kind of counter prop from opposition, or at least a case that explains this is actually bad because it has some kind of negative effect on a specific group of people. So a lot of your framing in PM is like framing in the abstract. In general, this motion is good for group of people X. Group of people X are really important in the world for this reason. We should prioritize the interests of group X in this motion. Therefore, by proving that this motion is good for group X, we have won the debate. Opposition going to be like, but maybe it's not good for group X in this highly specific way, or but actually in helping group X, you harm group Y, and that's bad. So your job in deputy is then to frame based on whatever the contention from op is. So like, well, so we have benefited X in a way, but they've said we've harmed them in another way. Here's my frame as to why like the way we're helping them is actually the more relevant of the two, blah, 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 blah. Equally, they say we harm this other group of people, we don't for this reason, and or we don't care about the fact that we're harming them for this other reason. So your frame shouldn't be repetitive. It should be sort of responding to whatever attacks you're getting from the other side directly or in POIs. Also, certainly with extensions that we'll talk about in a bit, like probably you're doing a lot more framing in WIP and you're more concerned with just getting the matter out. So while the headline of the frame might be present, our frame is that group X is more important than group Y. Here are all of the benefits to group X. You might need to add in a bunch of extra stuff on why your frame is justified and relevant, even if the sort of assertion of the frame is there. You might need to back it up later. When Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Leader of Op to some extent, how do you deal with having very little time to determine what your speech is going to be and how you best divide your attention between writing your own speech and listening to Leader of Op? Fair comment. I think this is probably something you get a lot better at over time. Me personally, I think what I end up doing is I often, if I'm deputy for almost either side, I will usually go into the debate with either a completely blank piece of paper, or I have like an idea of like a thing that I could chuck in as my DPM sort of extension, new material. Probably I spend most of the Prime Minister's speech writing out whatever it is the new thing that I'm going to say is, or certainly some options for new things. I think if you're a deputy speaker in general, you have to get comfortable with being able to speak with worse or fewer notes than if you are an extension or a prime minister, or an extension or a first speaker in opening. In terms of how do you divide your writing when you're listening to the LO, again, as I said, hopefully by the time the LO starts, you've got a reasonable handle on what you're going to say as your new bit, and then you've just got nice big blank piece of paper to deal with whatever they say. Hopefully they are vaguely competent at debating and have some kind of discernible structure where they first be like, oh, some rebuttal to Prime Minister, oh, here's my own argument, and then you just kind of copy whatever their structure is because it's easier to write chronologically as they're saying things, you're writing responses. Just keeping your notes like relatively, I would say, clear and on the brief side is going to help you here a lot. If you are still, whilst Leader of Op is speaking, trying to write out whatever your substantive is, it's going to be a bit of a mess and you're not going to be able to get there properly. So, okay, good stuff. If there are more questions about deputy, etc. stuff, we can talk about some of them later. Let us move swiftly on to whips. So whips, again, there are about a million, probably not a million, but there are a lot of very good workshops by very good people, better than myself, on YouTube telling you exactly how to structure whips. All different structures. Should I go team by team? Should I go clash by clash? All of these answers exist somewhere in the ether. So let's just highlight some very important things that you should be doing as a whip speaker. The first thing is, as we said before, it is very important to communicate effectively with your partner throughout the debate. If you are a deputy PM or a deputy leader of op, probably not much is going to change based on when you enter the debate room to when you give your speech about like the broad thrust of your case. What you need to be comfortable with as an extension speaker and also as a whip speaker is basically just being like, hey, this extension we prepared is now entirely irrelevant. Let's just start again. But it's much easier to start again or to take the extension speech you have prepared and reframe it, change it a bit in a way that makes it really relevant to the debate if you have that guidance. Now, it's quite hard as an extension speaker to understand how should I change my speech and then write all of those changes in your speech simultaneously while also trying to track rebuttal and blah, blah. It's very, very hard. So as a whip, this is where you can be helping your partner a lot. You should be communicating and saying, look, the extension we need to run needs to prove this thing. And then it's like, oh, okay, maybe some of our stuff we prepped is relevant. Maybe we need to write some new stuff. But it's your job as a whip to be building throughout the debate. The thing we started off this session with, the simple 3-sentence story of why you have won the debate, you are working that out as a whip. And then hopefully by telling it to your extension speaker, you two then collectively can work to retroactively meet whatever that story is. If you need to frame that someone is irrelevant in the debate, and you have a nice reason, because they have talked about this group, but actually their policy doesn't affect that group much at all. Well, fine, that's a decent enough frame. Now you've got to spend the legwork to actually work out what are the substantive reasons that it doesn't affect the group they claim it affects very much. That's something that your extension speaker will need to be doing. You can probably do a lot of that in rebuttal in your whip as well, and so you won't get accused of being new, but the frame and the idea needs to be present in extension. So again, communication is key. Listen to the debate, work out, how do I get rid of these other teams in the debate and make my case winning? A subsidiary to this is that if you look at the very top teams, no one bothers with analysis extensions because they are a waste of everyone's time. Analysis extensions are only really useful if either the team has missed something like glaringly obvious in their own case. They have a bunch of mechanisms for a harm, but have never weighed that harm in the slightest. At that point, it's sort of barely an analysis extension because you're actually just giving a whole bunch of new stuff just on a thing that's already been said. But it's like a kind of, rather than adding extra weighing or extra impacts, extra mechanisms, they were just completely devoid of them in the first place. What good teams tend to do is you just frame your way out of the debate. And there are lots of really good examples of this all over the internet. Most closing half wins. Most of the time, when a closing half team wins an out round, for example, or a final, is very easy to see. It's because they have stood up in member and gone, aha, this debate you thought was about what all the other teams have said. Actually, it's about this entirely different thing that is more important. Or, all of their analysis is contingent on this thing happening. So for example, I watched, what was it? It was the Doxbridge final the other day. Closing up were like, aha, all of Gov's stuff is contingent on, the motion was like the Republicans should try and get Trump impeached or whatever. And they were like, aha, all of their analysis is contingent on Trump being impeached probably anyway by the Democrats. But actually they're wrong. It turns out in hindsight, closing up were wrong, as we saw this morning. But the kind of general idea here is the correct one, which is it is much, much, much easier, instead of having to rebut the combined force of the two teams opposite you and their 30 minutes of speaking, it's much easier to just be like, yeah, so they gave this argument for 3 minutes, but honestly, I don't care for this like 20-second piece of framing that means it's irrelevant. Just in terms of time management, it's easier. In terms of convincing a judge you are right, it's substantially easier. If they make five mechanistic reasons, you try and rebut all of them, and the judge is like convinced by a couple of your responses, but not convinced by some of the others, you'll get to the end of the debate and just be like, yeah, you gave some rebuttal. I just thought on balance, I found their mechanisms probably did stand to the end. And you'll just be there like, wow, okay, that was unfortunate. Because it's hard to go toe to toe, particularly with opening teams who have had a lot more time to develop their arguments, right? If you're trying to rebut the prime minister and the deputy prime minister and the member of gov and the gov whip, you're not going to be able to deal with their material in the same level of depth that they presented it in. At which point it becomes strategically much better to try and find reasons why whole chunks of their case can just be broadly discounted. So this is where you're trying to find nice bits of framing that say, and again, from my own debating career, the sort of canonical example of this is the Zagreb Euros final, which you should watch. The team who win, closing opposition, were somewhat drunk because they thought they were going out in the semi, and probably the sort of on paper you would expect the weakest team in that final, but they won very, very clearly. The motion was words to the effect of feminist movement should sort of always be pacifist, oppose wars in general. Gov's like, oh, this will be good because war is anti-feminist, and Op's like, no, war can be good for feminism. And closing Gov's like, here are some extra reasons why war can actually be good for feminism. And closing Op is just like, guys, no one gives a single fuck what the feminist movements say about the war in Iraq. They're just going to ignore them. So they're probably not going to affect anything about the war itself. Probably they should just not waste all of their time advocating for this when no one cares what they say, and advocate for, like, I don't know, something else where people might care what the feminist movement has to say. Stuff about, like, I don't know, maternity leave, abortion rights, other things where what the feminist movements say is actually relevant. It's sort of the canonical political capital is finite and zero sum to an extension. And it's like, when you think about it, you're like, yeah, like, it's not the most sophisticated argument in the world, but it does make a lot of sense. And it's very easy for a judge to tell themselves, yeah, like this actually is pretty compelling. Okay. And again, the speech was delivered with a great deal of sort of hilarity and mocking of the other teams in the final, which helps sell your single line. On some level, debating is not particularly objective, it's all subjective. If you can convince judges that the other three teams in the debate are kind of stupid and have missed the point, you are probably going to win. So framing is always, always, always more effective than line by line rebuttal. That does not mean that you should not do line by line rebuttal. Obviously, there will be some arguments that you can't reasonably frame out, often because they sort of rely on premises that your arguments also rely on, and then you will need to rebut them. You can sort of still try, right? The sort of classic, even if your argument is wrong for these two reasons. But if it's not wrong and it's right, it doesn't matter because it's outweighed by this other thing, or it is irrelevant because of this other piece of logic. Always good to try and do both, but remember that the more time you spend on line by line, the less time you're going to have for big picture, and the less time you, unlike the sort of less likely it is that you will be able to completely kick out all of that material. Yeah, and so with regards to things like structure, it honestly doesn't matter. Just pick whatever is appropriate for the debate. For example, if you are Gov Whip, I will almost always, if I'm Gov Whip, deal with closing opposition on their own. You probably have, hopefully, by the end of the member of Gov speech, you've got all of the sort of whipping parts of your whip, explaining why your extension beats opening Gov and opening op. All of the rebuttal to opening op, rebuilding is all good to go. What you need to deal with is whatever member of ops extension is. So you want to have that speech, 2/3 of the speech is pre-written. You've just got a sort of 3-minute or so gap where you're going to deal with whatever it is that closing op throws at you. And if you are able to devote your complete attention to just listening to and then rebutting that one speech, you will do a lot better as closing government. So thinking about how you do it then, I suppose with closing government, I very often find myself doing sort of closing opposition first and then maybe clashes, maybe teams. It often very much depends on the structure and the nature of the debate itself. Sometimes teams have wildly different conceptions of what the debate is about, and you do need to deal with them separately. Other times they're all arguing more or less from a shared set of principles. They're just arguing like which way does a tipping point go, and in that case sort of clash or issue by issue does make sense. But the main point should be that whatever your story is, the answer to the question of why, but what was a relevant argument, what did win the debate, is always whatever it is your partner has said. And as long as you're echoing those sentences, even if the specific reasons that you're giving are more complicated, more detailed, etc., you're probably still doing relatively well. So try and frame stuff out, concede things that are irrelevant, ignore things that are trivial, and then you will hopefully be onto a winner as long as your communication is good and your extension is actually meaningful. This workshop is not really about how do you make a meaningful extension, but as I said, the best thing to do is to just listen really carefully to top half. What did they miss? Pick an area of clash. Opening government says one thing, opening opposition agrees. The best extension is usually one that answers the biggest and best argument from your diagonally opposite opening team. So if you're closing opposition, your extension should be, look, opening government have made like 20 arguments about why thing X is bad. we're just going to say thing X is good and give you 20 reasons why. You want to set yourself up in direct opposition to the strongest material of the other side, and then you're onto a winner. Because if you beat them, you beat them. If the judges, if it was the really strong material from the other side, you're now trivially more relevant than the opening team on your side because you're dealing with the strongest material, the biggest clashes in the debate, and then you've just got to rebut the team opposite you to a sufficient extent that you beat them as well. I guess the only other tips and tricks are like, don't just repeat your extension speaker. Don't be like, we said this argument, it was really good, and I will now repeat everything they said. There is no use in repeating things they said, either material or rebuttal. You should be referring to things they said. So we made this argument, we gave you 3 reasons. The reason was A, B, and C. I'm not actually going to explain what they were because we already said them. I will only deal with relevant bits of rebuttal that the other side says, or I will add in a little bit of extra analysis and framing as to why these things are really, really good, why the other team's responses were insufficient. The other thing that people often repeat is sort of member of op has spent a bunch of time rebutting opening gov or member of gov, and then the op whip who had also written down a bunch of rebuttal during the opening gov speeches and the member of gov speeches is like, but I sort of already planned to do all this stuff, so I'll just say it again and hope that it is now, adding value, when in reality it's not. So whips. Yes. All right. Some questions we got in advance now. So, advanced question number 1. On rebuttal, some arguments and parts of arguments are more important to address than others. How do we decide what is key and what isn't as important? So, there are different ways an argument can be important. Probably the most important one is it's not important in the abstract, but is it important to the round? So have they made like an argument that rests on a particular premise? If so, that is an important premise to attack. If they've given like 7 different impacts and you don't rebut all of them, it's not the end of the world, okay? Generally, the better and more detailed the argument is, the more important it is for you to attack it. Similarly, it will depend on how good your framing is. Do you think your framing is sufficiently strong that you can just discount this argument at face value? Or is your sort of framing a little bit suspect and you might need to spend a bunch of time doing even ifs? Essentially, sort of, hopefully you also do judging. And this is another piece of advice I would give, certainly for people, for all debaters, but in particular people who are whips. It is a good idea to judge where you can, particularly to judge good tournaments, to see how good speakers give cases. Because if you are a half competent judge and you are now speaking as deputy leader of op in some debate, probably the arguments that are important from opening gov are probably the arguments that you would think are important were you judging the debate. So essentially, you've got to sort of put your judging hat on and be like, if I was judging this debate, what arguments are important? What arguments seem relevant to the motion? Which things have detail and merits behind them? Which things were just like lazily asserted? You want to cover your bases. Even if you think an argument was stupid, it's probably a good reason to explain why it's wrong or why it's stupid. But for the most part, whatever things you think a reasonable judge is likely to think are important, it's exactly the same. There is no difference, really. So basically, I would say try judging more and you will get a better feel for what arguments are important. But in general, important arguments are ones that have sort of big impacts or are like really relevant to particular actors that are mentioned in the motion, or seem like they have a lot of weight behind them, or indeed if they're saying them. If opening op comes up and says, we're going to win this debate by proving this one impact to this one group of people, well, it sounds like most of their case is geared around that. So that's definitely the thing you should be rebutting. So see what the other teams say is important and go after those things as well as your own intuitions from judging. All right, Question number 2. This isn't really a question, it's just a word with a question mark after it. Meta debating. Sure. I guess it depends. Meta debating is very powerful if you are good at it. Meta debating really just means framing. If your meta debating is they didn't take any POIs, then that is irrelevant. If your meta debating is their model was bad, unless you can explain why that means that, you know, the debate has been harmed in some way, then it's not very useful. But meta debating in terms of just like comparing between teams on sort of, well, I'm going to rebut opening opposition now. Now, closing opposition's argument was effectively the same as opening opposition's. They just added in this one like, little extra thing. Now, you making that comment doesn't necessarily affect you. At least hopefully, if judges are doing their job correctly, whether closing op is derivative of opening op or not doesn't actually affect their interaction with closing government if judges know the rules of BP debating. But, you know, often they don't and they just vibe it. So if you are just trying to make it more difficult for them or forcing closing opposition to now spend a bunch of time doing things like trying to at length explain why they are not derivative of opening opposition, that's less time they can spend rebutting you. So these sorts of things can sometimes be worth it, but only if they are an addition, shall we say, to your better responses. It's sort of the golden rule of like mocking people in rebuttal. If you're going to mock someone in rebuttal, you better make sure that you're correct about it. So give an actual response and then be like, also, that was stupid. Ha, 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 ha. And then the other team will be very angry that you said that argument was stupid, get extremely incensed about it, and then ignore the actual response that you did give. And probably they'll be salty about losing the debate afterwards, but it doesn't really matter because you won. So I'm not really sure what more there is to say about this. If someone has a very particular meta debating question, I'm happy to answer it, but it's sort of a bit of a broad category of things to just slap a question mark on. What? No POIs is against the rules of BP debate. I don't know what that means. Yes, you should take POIs from people. It's more just about who you take POIs from. Okay. Next, for the Deputy Speeches Workshop, hooray, we're already there. Advice on how to outframe your back half / how to deal with situations where the other top half team is not particularly strong, but the back half teams are your main competition would be ideal. So for this, this is a good question, to be fair, and it is annoying when this happens. I think the best thing to do is if you know, let's say you're OG and the two good teams in the debate are closing half and you know that opening op have sort of Icarus and they shouldn't be in this room and they're going to fourth anyway. It's good to sort of bear in mind what the risks of the strong teams being back half is, right? That they have their own little mini internal debate with each other. There's lots of engagement there. There's lots of back and forth there. What that means is they're only going to win if the relevant issues are the ones that are analyzed there. So what that means is that your case from opening has got to be pretty much straight down the middle, shall we say. If you are opening government, make the trivially most obvious, most reasonable, straight down the middle case, frame it in the abstract a lot, take all of your POIs from the closing half team opposite you, hope that the opening half team takes that from opposite you as, take the opening op team takes a bunch from closing gov and think about it. Try and tough burn a little bit and listen carefully. But the best way you're going to win is by having a really, really robust case. You can't outframe them in the literal sense because you don't know what they're going to say. You can't have like a preemptive frame. What you can do is have the most obvious frame and also just mech out loads of things or concede loads of things to sort of minimize debates. If you want to, you can be sneaky with your mechanism to try and narrow the debate sort of in terms of scope of things the debate is about. So there is still very clearly a debate between two sides about one central issue. But if you're like, we are only talking about this in the very explicit case where conditions A, B, and C are met, there's less room for closing gov to be like, aha, and here's how this thing works in, you know, some other scenario. The developing world extension. Well, we mech that out from opening by saying we will only do this in countries where these conditions are met to make the debate clear. And as long as you sound reasonable whilst you're doing it, right? As long as it sounds like you're not doing this just to be childish or to avoid parts of the debate, you're like, look, there are many different interpretations of this motion. For simplicity's sake, we're going to set the debate up explicitly as being on these grounds. That means that we can then, make, if we reduce the number of possible arguments in the debate from 10 to 5, and then say 3 of them quite well, turf burn the other 1 or maybe even 2 if we're efficient in deputy, then it's going to be quite hard for the closing team to beat us. In those scenarios, you do sometimes have the advantage of, and I've been in debates where I thought there are 3 strong teams, and the weakest one is the one. If I'm I'm thinking of a particular debate in mind where I was closing opposition. The strong teams were opening opposition and closing government. It's not a great place to be in. Because opening government will be kind of irrelevant. Opening opposition will say all of the relevant material, and then you in closing have to come up with something neat, but you don't really have much to go on because opening op is winning the opening half so decisively that there's no pivot for your extension. There's no like, aha, the opening half is sort of hung up on this one issue. We will win the debate by beating the last outstanding thing from opening government because there's nothing there. And then closing government is the only gov team who makes any relevant material in the debate. And then you're in closing op and you're like, well, all the relevant op stuff has been said, all the relevant gov stuff has been said. Oh no. So that's your best bet. If you're opening half, probably the team you're most likely to beat is the team that's on your bench. So if I'm opening government and I think the 2 strong teams, the 2 other strong teams in the room are closing gov and closing op, it is most likely that the team that I will beat out of those 2 will be closing government. Okay, because you can say all of the good material, and hopefully if opening opposition isn't very good, a lot of your stuff will still be standing. Closing op will therefore have to spend a lot of time engaging with you because the good material is still there. It's also kind of in closing op's interest to call closing gov derivative, so they'll probably do that anyway. And that's probably your best plan. Straight down the middle, make sure you decisively win top half and just matter load everything, frame everything, so you've just got a really nice simple story from the get-go that isn't really touched until closing half begins, and you'll do okay. Next, how to win, or at least come a strategic, I don't know what a strategic second is, but sure, a strategic second in debates when you have 0 context on the motion, how to better structure your speech during the debate. So if you have 0 context at all, not gonna lie, you're probably a bit fucked. So read more. But it does happen from time to time. So, maybe like a niche IR motion, this house would, I don't know, partition some country. This house would partition the Yemen. Sure, you probably know a little bit about it, but you don't know enough to give any meaningful arguments that are more than just sort of vague assertions. Probably your best bet here is in rebuttal. So if you are closing, it's always better to be closing on these debates, right? If you're opening half on a debate you know nothing about, then it's not going to go well for you. If you're closing half, try and broaden the debate. Go after premises and basically just give rebuttal for 14 minutes. If you're closing gov and you just rebut all of both op teams, sure, maybe you lose to the team that in opening government that actually knew what the debate is about and made a bunch of good arguments. But generally, just by rebutting the other team very, very aggressively from closing half, you usually can get yourself into some semblance of a second. Like if you're not even trying to beat the team ahead of you and you're just trying to ride through on their coattails and rebut everything the other side has said, and there you need less knowledge, right? It's easier to deconstruct an argument, even if you don't know what it's about, because you can just deconstruct like logic in it. You can sort of be like, that just kind of sounds true, so I'll make some assertions up. You've got something to go on, basically. If you're making an argument about something you don't know about, you're making it from nothing. If you're rebutting, you've got the thing you need to rebut, so you've got some way of intuiting through it. Listen to all of the other teams and try and use their own words and analysis against them. Learn from the things that the teams say in the debate, and that will help you. But I guess the general thing is just good to know some things about some things. You don't need to know a lot about anything. But even in a debate like, this house would partition the Yemen, I know nothing about it really. I stopped reading the news. But I suppose you can probably make some relatively generic arguments about like the problems of where you draw borders, border conflicts, like different sort of parts of the country being run by organizations that have very different ideologies and will have different international support, and like this will escalate the conflict and blah 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 blah. And then you can just analogize to other things, but like here are some other countries where we partitioned them. India, that didn't go well, here are a bunch of reasons why. That sort of thing, and sort of use the knowledge you do have. You just got to do enough to sort of find a way of being able to bring it in as a relevant analogy. The niche of the debate motion, the more likely this is, but equally that means that other teams, if it's a really niche motion, probably other teams don't know very much either, and the judge doesn't know very much either, which means that it's a bit easier to get away with, and there's sort of an incentive for everyone to go general. There was a debate, again, I keep using Doxbridge examples just because of the last tournament I was at. There was a debate about different models of economic growth in China, like Guangdong and Chongqing or whatever it is. Nobody really knew anything, so they just kind of made it generally about different structures. But equally, lots of people didn't really know the specific examples of what the debate was about, which meant that everyone is kind of in the same boat. So if you can sound like you know what you're talking about by just giving more general arguments or using that little bit of knowledge you do have that is in some way tangentially relevant to the motion, you'll probably do a lot better. All right, those are all of the advanced questions. So does anyone have any other questions? You can type them in the chat, or if no one is typing, I don't mind you unmuting and just saying them out loud. All right. Unless someone is typing very, very slowly, it seems like we don't have any more questions. Oh no, we do have a question. Should you listen to your PM or LO as a deputy speaker? I mean, vaguely, how many notes of their speech should you have from prep? So this is what I normally do. I sort of half listen to them to get inspiration for new things I'm writing down. But if they say what they're supposed to say, you should have an idea of what they are saying. In terms of, I like to make sure that I know what they're going to say. And I will often have it written down maybe on a piece of paper. So like just before, what I often do is in the last couple of minutes of prep time, I'll be like, all right, so to be clear, what is our case? Or like, what are you going to say? What order? And I might get them to show me that. I'll just take their notes off them, right? Because they've probably written like 4 or 5 pages of notes. You can read the first couple whilst they're writing the last one. I would make sure that you have a good idea of what they're saying, because it will help you. You might read through and be like, oh, actually, can you add this one thing in? Or you might be sort of aware that you can, you might have an idea of sort of how you can, how it can be responded to or framed based on what they said. But it's generally good to have a good idea before the speech starts. And hopefully the speech says what you were expecting it to say. So I would make sure at the end of prep time, you've got a good idea. Indeed, with online debating, it's even easier, right? Because if people are doing things like writing their speech notes on Google Docs, then you can just read the Google Doc with them. So I would say have a good idea of what they're planning on saying before the speech even starts, so you can sort of order it in your mind of what you're expecting. Then I do listen, obviously, but I'm also during that time writing stuff for my speech as well. And it will also, if you read beforehand, will help you know, are there particular parts I need to pay attention to? Are there notes like, oh, I'm slightly worried that, for example, they might not have time to, and that's something we didn't discuss, right? If let's say Prime Minister wants to make 3 arguments, but they cock up their timing and only do 2 of them, something you've got to be aware of, because you might then need to give that argument if it's like a really important part of your case. A lot of what we've already talked about is like sort of like the plan, but very often the plan can go wrong. So listen to them, sort of half listen, but I'm not making notes on what they say because I should already know what they're supposed to say. How do you deal with scenarios where your partner fucked up and you have to pivot your how we win strategy last minute? Pretend that that was always what you were going to do by doing it as rebuttal to the other side. Be like, so we made this argument. Now, ops big challenges, blah, 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 blah. So let me respond to that by saying something else. If you are, as a whip, radically changing it, you are probably just going to lose at this point. If it like is trivially irrelevant and you're just in whip trying to do it, like, yeah, I guess the scenario is pick better partners. No, that's a joke. Make sure that you have communicated well with your partner in prep time. Like that, you should hopefully never have a debate where you're a whip and your partner just goes like completely rogue and you had no idea they were going to say this. It might be the case that they say what you planned and then it becomes very clear. Let's say your closing member of Gov sort of goes as planned, and then member of Op is like, ha ha ha, that was really dumb. Here's a bunch of reasons why. And you listen to them and like, oh wow, that actually was really dumb. I guess they're correct. Just sort of claw back. I think if you try and radically pivot away, it will become very obvious. You will get accused of whip standing. The judging panel will also notice that you're like radically running away from what your partner says, and you probably will end up making it worse than fixing it. The general piece of advice I would give actually though is that for me, I found doing proams incredibly helpful as a whip speaker, because if you do lots of proams, you will realize that where you are the pro, I should specify. Obviously, it's also useful to do it the other way around. But once you're sort of like half competent at debating, doing proams where you're the am is just like, oh, hooray, Jason carried me to win a tournament. I didn't really learn very much. I just got carried by someone who's very good. It's good to be the pro-am even when you're kind of mediocre when you're the pro, because it will teach you a level of independence whereby you need to win based on your speech. And yes, your am will miss the point or say arguments wrong or frame things poorly, because of course they will. They're an am. They're just learning how the game works. And so that added layer of responsibility will actually help you deal with these scenarios when they come up, and it will also make you a lot better. I found it made me a lot better, even then going back to speaking with like sort of good people again. That level of sort of communication and hand-holding that you get a bit used to when you're pro-amming people. You're obviously not going to do it as much, but you sort of a distilled version of, all right, we must make this argument. You must say these, like make these two claims at the very least, call them out on this one thing, will help you focus and clarify your job as a whip before your speech starts in terms of communicating with your partner and making sure these things don't happen. With a lot of these scenarios, there's sort of not a great answer and you're just going to lose, but you can make it less likely that these scenarios occur and be better at dealing with them if you have some things like this. Does the stuff about not doing major parts of the case and focusing on rebutting with DLO, or is it different because LO has already butted the big gov arguments? Reasonable question. DLO probably hasn't done, DLO isn't doing as much rebuttal as DPM probably, because DLO also needs to spend a lot of time doing the bulk of the op case, right? So I would say, yes, if you are in DLO, you probably aren't adding major parts of the case, you are doing rebuttal. You might be able to add, like, it's sort of, to use a horrible debating word, it is symmetric, because if the leader of op has done lots of rebuttal, yes, you need to do a bit less rebuttal, but that probably means that you must spend more time doing substantive because the leader of op has done a bad job with their substantive. In the inverse case, where leader of op has done loads and loads of substantive, not done so much rebuttal, you need to be spending more time on rebuttal. So you will need to sort of deal with it. Probably, however, you if leader of op makes a bunch of rebuttal to prime minister, deputy prime minister is going to like rebuild and recontextualize, and you will need to sort of go again. Bear in mind that member of gov has no real desire or obligation to support opening gov's material. So if you can, after DLO, like conclusively kill opening government dead, there's no reason why closing government are ever going to try and support them. They'll just ignore it. So that's like a nice feather in your cap, and you've probably decisively won the top half by this point. So I would still focus in DLO on getting the rebuttal out to completely kill opening government. And then, yes, I suppose if your leader of op has done quite a lot of rebuttal, you can do a little bit of extra case building if you need to, but the major building blocks should already be there. I feel the rules of BP debating explicitly allow you as a deputy to bring new material. Isn't squandering that advantage to not bring every possible idea contribution, essentially acting as essentially you are to. Yeah, I mean, sure, you can bring new material. I think basically, if you look at, for example, any of the world's finals where opening government won, they won largely because of the arguments made in prime minister. And then what the deputy prime minister did was they added context, did good rebuttal and framing, but there's no actual substantially new material that wasn't already present in some form in the prime minister here. Because as we said, as a judge, I sort of build in my mind my impression of the team. Am I going to have my impression of the team as the like 7-minute PM plus like, you know, rebuttal and rebuilding of DPM? So that probably, you know, like 10, 11 minutes of chat about a couple of arguments, or is it the extra arguments in deputy? Bear in mind also that any arguments you make in deputy prime minister are going to be rebutted by 3 speakers that you have very little chance to deal with, right? DLO will rebut you. Maybe closing opposition will rebut that part of the argument as well. It's much more likely that that bit of argument is going to get absolutely trashed by the opposition team, and you will have no defense other than POIs against it. You're way more likely to have that argument be strawmanned, for example, because if it's harder for teams, you know, opening up can't really strawman arguments that come out of PM, because you can then correct for that in DPM, for example. So those arguments are by their nature more vulnerable, which is why you should have hopefully had your strongest arguments already out in PM so you can defend them. So sure, like you can do it. And I'm not saying you should never give new material. I'm saying that you are much more likely to win the debate outright by having a very strong PM speech and then contextualizing and rebutting. Again, actually, like I think the Doxbridge World, the open final is another good example of this, right? The deputy speaker is effectively just whipping the prime minister and winning on the ground that have already been established as the relevant ones in the debate. So it can be useful. And obviously this is highly context dependent in terms of the motion, the round you're in. But you are more likely to win the debate with a very strong prime minister speech that is then contextualized and defended than sort of adding in a whole bunch of new extra stuff in deputy that is more likely to just kind of fizzle out into nothingness than it is to be a major part in why judges decide that your team placed whatever position you get in the debate. And I guess the other thing that, with regards to the whole like every possible idea, no, because if you add like 3 more arguments and all of them are effectively like 2 sentences that are poorly explained because you don't have time to do them all, you are not going to win the debate on any of them. They will be discounted as unproven by the judges, and you've just wasted time. If you want to spend the time to do it properly, you're like, aha, I will give like 2 minutes of rebuttal in deputy prime minister and then 5 minutes of new substantive. Probably your rebuttal is not good enough and you're going to lose to opening opposition. So it is about sort of thinking about, I guess this sort of very short summary is not all arguments in debating are equal. Some arguments are better than others. Pick the best ones, say them in PM, defend them. If you've got time, add in some extra stuff, but be aware that you're very unlikely to, with your 3rd, 4th, and 5th arguments, actually be that relevant to the debate. So it's more about prioritization of what is going to win you the debate rather than what you can do. Okay, any more questions? Otherwise, I think, what is it now? It is a panel discussion featuring Lucia, Hadar, Lovro, and Jason on how to get better at debating. All right, Okay, thanks everyone. I hope that was in some way useful. Stick around for the discussion.